Nobody could tame the Mafia boss's Pitbull. Then the waitress did something shocking. "Call him off, Silas. I swear I didn't touch the money. Just call him off." The man's voice cracked into a pathetic sob, tears streaming down his bruised face as he pressed his trembling back against the diner's locked glass door. A low, rumbling growl vibrated through the checkered floorboards. The Pitbull, a massive expanse of scarred silver muscle, bared his teeth, the sheer force of his presence sucking the oxygen from the room. Silas sat at the corner booth, methodically stirring his black coffee. He didn't blink. "He doesn't listen to me," Silas murmured, his voice a chilling, hollow whisper. "He listens to the truth." From behind the counter, Ruby held a ceramic pot, watching the beast. She knew exactly what nobody else did. The Midnight Owl Diner was a relic of a bygone era, a neon-drenched sanctuary tucked into the forgotten, rain-slicked underbelly of the city. It smelled perpetually of burnt filter coffee, old frying grease, and the sharp, metallic tang of ozone from the failing street lamps outside. To the average citizen, it was a place to grab a cheap slice of cherry pie after a late shift. To the city's criminal underworld, it was the throne room of the man they called the Architect. Silas did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His reputation was a suffocating blanket that draped over the city, woven from hushed rumors of ruthless efficiency and calculated vengeance. But the true source of the visceral, knee-shaking terror he inspired wasn't just his reputation, it was the creature that never left his side. Brutus was a pit bull of monstrous proportions. His coat was the color of a thunderhead, marred by jagged, pale pink scars that crisscrossed his broad snout and thick-neck souvenirs from a violent past that no one dared ask about. He moved with the heavy, deliberate grace of an apex predator, his thick muscles rolling fluidly beneath his skin. When Brutus looked at you, with those pale, unreadable amber eyes, you felt an ancient, primal instinct scream at you to run. He did not bark. He rarely made a sound at all, save for the deep, engine-like growl that seemed to rattle the very marrow in your bones. He was Silas's shadow, his enforcer, and his impenetrable shield. Men who would happily spit in the face of a loaded gun would find their knees giving out when the silver dog turned his heavy head in their direction. Ruby was on her second week serving at the diner. She was a woman carved from quiet endurance, with eyes the color of dark molasses that saw far more than she ever let on. She wore the faded, powder-blue diner uniform like a suit of armor, her movements behind the Formica counter precise, efficient, and entirely devoid of the nervous flutter that plagued the other staff members. The other waitresses drew straws to avoid serving Silas's corner booth, terrified that dropping a fork or speaking out of turn would provoke the beast lounging beneath the table. Ruby never participated in the drawing of straws. When her shift aligned with Silas's arrival, she simply picked up the coffee pot and walked over. On a particularly miserable Tuesday evening, the rain was lashing against the diner's broad windows in angry horizontal sheets. The establishment was empty save for Silas in his usual booth, Brutus curled into a tight, muscular ball at his feet, and two nervous-looking associates sitting across from the boss. Ruby approached, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking faintly against the linoleum. As she neared the table, the air grew noticeably colder, thick with the unspoken threats hanging between the men. Silas was dressed in a tailored charcoal suit that somehow managed to look both immaculate and menacing. He was staring at the two men, his expression a mask of bored indifference, while they sweated profusely, their eyes darting constantly down to the dog. Ruby didn't hesitate. She stepped up to the edge of the table, the steaming carafe held steady in her grip. "Refills, gentlemen?" she asked, her voice a calm, even alto that cut through the heavy tension like a warm knife through butter. The two associates flinched simultaneously. Beneath the table, Brutus stirred. The massive silver head rose, his amber eyes locking onto Ruby's apron. A low rumble began in his chest, a sound that made the cutlery on the table vibrate. The men across from Silas practically pressed themselves into the vinyl upholstery, their breath catching in their throats. Silas slowly turned his gaze toward Ruby, waiting for the inevitable reaction, the tremble of the hand, the wide-eyed panic, the hasty retreat. It was the reaction the dog demanded. It was the reaction Silas relied upon. Ruby, however, did nothing of the sort. She did not freeze, nor did she back away. She slowly lowered her gaze to meet the dog's amber eyes. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the waitress and the hellhound simply looked at one another, Ruby's breathing remained slow and deep. She didn't square her shoulders in a challenge, nor did she shrink in submission. She simply existed in his space, radiating an aura of absolute, unshakable calm. Slowly, the rumbling in the dog's chest subsided. Brutus blinked, let out a heavy, fluttering sigh through his broad nose, and rested his chin heavily across his front paws, his eyes sliding shut. Silas's eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. It was a microscopic shift in expression, but for a man who controlled his face as tightly as his empire, it was the equivalent of a shocked gasp. He looked from his sleeping protector to the waitress pouring black coffee into his mug. "He usually doesn't tolerate strangers," Silas stated, his voice a gravelly baritone that commanded absolute attention. "I'm not a stranger, Silas," Ruby replied evenly, setting the carafe back on her tray. "I've been pouring your coffee for a week, and I don't smell like fear." She didn't wait for his response, simply turning on her heel and walking smoothly back to the counter, leaving the mafia boss staring at the space she had just occupied, a foreign spark of curiosity igniting in the dark void of his eyes. The atmosphere in the Midnight Owl the following Friday was tighter than a coiled spring. The neon sign outside sputtered and buzzed, casting erratic, blood-red shadows across the wet pavement. Inside, the diner was uncharacteristically crowded. A heavy-set man named Vargas, known in the underworld for his volatile temper and sloppy operations, had requested a sit-down with Silas. Vargas had brought 3 of his own men, all of whom looked like they had been dressed in the dark and fueled by cheap adrenaline. They crowded into the booth adjacent to Silas's, their loud voices and erratic movements disrupting the calculated sanctuary Silas had established. Silas sat in his corner, a portrait of lethal stillness. Beneath the table, Brutus was rigid. The dog's muscles were visibly corded with tension, his thick neck strained, his amber eyes darting rapidly from Vargas to the men flanking him. The air was thick with the scent of cheap cologne, stale sweat, and the sharp, undeniable pheromones of human anxiety. Every time one of Vargas's men shifted their weight or reached for a napkin, Brutus let out a sharp, clicking growl, his upper lip curling just enough to reveal the gleaming white tips of his canines. The message was clear. One wrong move, and the diner would become a slaughterhouse. Ruby watched the scene unfold from her station behind the register. She was systematically wiping down the stainless steel counter, but her dark eyes never left the corner booth. She could read the geometry of the room like a blueprint. She saw the way Vargas's jaw clenched, the way his men kept their hands hovering precariously close to their jacket pockets. But more importantly, she watched the dog. She watched the rapid rise and fall of Brutus's ribcage, the frantic, almost desperate sweeps of his gaze. While everyone else in the room saw a bloodthirsty predator waiting to be unleashed, Ruby saw something entirely different. She saw an animal overwhelmed by a sensory nightmare. The breaking point arrived with mundane cruelty. One of Vargas's enforcers, a twitchy man with a scarred cheek, gestured wildly as he argued a point about territory. In his careless enthusiasm, his elbow collided violently with a tall glass of ice water sitting on the edge of their table. The glass tipped, hovered for a gut-wrenching millisecond, and then plummeted to the floor. The sound of the thick diner glass shattering against the linoleum was like a gunshot in the tense, suffocating quiet of the room. Instantly, the diner erupted into chaos. Vargas's men leaped to their feet, hands darting into their jackets. Silas remained seated, but his hand moved to the heavy silver cane resting against his thigh. But it was Brutus who reacted with explosive violence. The massive Pitbull lunged from beneath the table, a terrifying blur of silver muscle and bared teeth. He didn't go for the man who dropped the glass. He spun wildly in the center of the aisle, a guttural, terrifying roar tearing from his throat, his jaws snapping at the empty air, completely disoriented by the sudden chaos. Vargas screamed, scrambling backward over the vinyl booth. "Call off the dog, Silas. Call him off or we shoot." Silas's face was an unreadable mask, but his hand gripped the cane so tightly his knuckles were white. "Brutus, down," he commanded. But the dog didn't even twitch in his direction. Brutus was trapped in a whirlwind of perceived threats, his heavy paws slipping on the spilled water and crushed glass, his roars echoing off the ceiling. Before the first gun could clear its holster, Ruby moved. She didn't run. Running would trigger a predator's chase instinct. She walked with rapid, heavy, deliberate steps, her thick-soled shoes hitting the floorboards with rhythmic thuds. She walked straight into the kill zone, placing her body squarely between the terrified, gun-toting thugs and the frantic Pitbull. "Ruby, get back!" Silas barked, his voice finally cracking with genuine alarm. It was the first time anyone had heard him sound anything other than perfectly controlled. Ruby ignored him. She stopped exactly 2 feet from the thrashing dog. She didn't reach out. She didn't speak. Instead, she stomped her right foot onto the floor with immense force. Thud. The vibration traveled through the floorboards. Brutus's head snapped toward her. In that fraction of a second of eye contact, Ruby dropped to one knee. Ignoring the shards of glass biting through her uniform pants, she made her body as small and unthreatening as possible, crossing her arms loosely over her chest, and took a slow, deep, exaggerated breath, letting her shoulders drop dramatically. The transformation was instantaneous and shocking. Brutus stared at her, his broad chest heaving. The frantic energy seemed to hit an invisible wall. He looked at her relaxed posture, felt the absence of panic radiating from her. The terrifying roar died in his throat, replaced by a confused whine. Slowly, tentatively, the massive dog took a step forward, lowered his head, and pressed his scarred snout gently against Ruby's knee. The entire diner held its breath, trapped in a state of suspended animation, as the waitress gently uncrossed her arms and laid a steady, calloused hand on the back of the mafia boss's hellhound. The diner was closed. The neon sign outside had been switched off, plunging the interior into a moody, cinematic gloom, illuminated only by the warm, yellow glow of the pendant lights above the counter. The air smelled of harsh ammonia and lingering fryer grease. Ruby was mopping the floor near the entrance, moving the wet strings across the linoleum in rhythmic, hypnotic arcs. Silas was still there, sitting alone in his corner booth. He had sent his driver away hours ago. Brutus was sprawled across the aisle, his massive head resting on his paws, watching Ruby with heavy, half-lidded eyes. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with the weight of the evening's events. Silas watched the waitress work. He had spent his entire life reading people, dissecting their fears, their motivations, their weaknesses. He built his empire on the predictable nature of human frailty. But Ruby was an anomaly. She possessed a quiet, steel-reinforced core that completely defied the environment she worked in. When Vargas's men had drawn their weapons, grown men had wept. Ruby had stepped into the crossfire and tamed a monster without raising her voice. "You're bleeding," Silas observed, his voice breaking the long silence. It wasn't a question, but a statement of fact, delivered with his usual cold detachment. Ruby paused, leaning heavily on the wooden handle of the mop. She looked down at her right leg. A dark patch of blood had seeped through the faded blue fabric of her uniform trousers, right around the knee where she had knelt in the broken glass. She sighed, a soft, weary sound, and reached into her apron pocket, pulling out a crumpled napkin. She pressed it against the stain. "It's just a scratch." The adrenaline wore off. "You shouldn't have stepped in front of the dog," Silas said, taking a slow sip from a glass of amber liquid he had poured from a silver flask. "Vargas's men are amateurs. Amateurs have nervous fingers. You could have been killed over a spilled glass of water." Ruby resumed mopping, the wet slap swish of the cotton head returning to the quiet room. "If I hadn't stepped in, one of those nervous amateurs would have shot your dog, and then you would have killed all 4 of them, and I would be the one stuck scrubbing blood out of the grout instead of just coffee." She didn't look up as she spoke, her tone remarkably conversational for a woman discussing a massacre. Silas chuckled. It was a dark, dry sound that lacked any real warmth. "You are remarkably practical, Ruby, but practicality doesn't explain how you stopped a 100-pound Pitbull mid-rage. My own handlers can't get near him when he's triggered. He's damaged." Silas's eyes drifted down to the sleeping dog, a fleeting shadow of something resembling regret crossing his hardened features. "I found him in a basement fighting ring I was clearing out. They had starved him, beaten him, turned him into a weapon. He was the only thing left alive in that room. I took him because we understood each other. We both know what it means to be built for violence." Ruby stopped mopping again. She walked over to the booth, carrying the scent of bleach and honest sweat. She slid into the seat opposite Silas, completely ignoring the unspoken rule that no one sat at the boss's table uninvited. Brutus lifted his head, gave Ruby's knee a gentle sniff, and rested his chin on her shoe. "He's not built for violence, Silas," Ruby said softly, her dark eyes locking onto his. "He's built for loyalty." The violence was just the language he was forced to learn to survive. She reached down, her fingers gently tracing the pale pink scar tissue behind the dog's left ear. "You think he protects you because he's a monster. But you're wrong. Then why does he do it?" Silas challenged, his voice dropping an octave, a defensive edge creeping in. He wasn't used to being analyzed, especially not by a waitress in a cheap diner. "Because he's terrified of losing the only thing that anchors him," Ruby replied, her voice steady and unwavering. She looked away from the dog and back to Silas. "I grew up in a house where the doors were always locked from the outside, and the anger was unpredictable. I know what it looks like when something is lashing out because it wants to hurt you. And I know what it looks like when something is lashing out because it's suffocating in panic." She leaned forward slightly, the diner lights reflecting in her dark eyes. "Brutus doesn't attack because he's vicious. He attacks because the world is too loud, too fast, and too threatening. He's not your weapon, Silas. He's your mirror." Silas stared at her, the silence stretching taut between them. No one had ever spoken to him with such naked, unvarnished honesty. No one had ever dared to look past the tailored suits and the terrifying reputation to see the fractured foundation beneath. He looked down at the massive dog, then back to the woman with the blood-stained knee. For the first time in his life, the architect of the underworld didn't know what to say. The uneasy peace established in the quiet hours of the night was shattered exactly 3 days later. The city was gripped by a sudden, violent cold snap. An Arctic front that turned the rain into driving sleet and froze the puddles in the alleyways solid. Inside the Midnight Owl, the heating vents rattled a desperate metallic tune, trying to combat the chill that seeped through the walls. The broad front windows were thickly frosted with condensation, blurring the iconic, sputtering neon signs outside into smeared, bloody streaks of red and harsh blue. It was past 2 a.m. The diner was officially closed, the open sign buzzing faintly but entirely unlit. Silas was inside, hunched over a spread of thick, leather-bound ledger books spread across his usual corner booth. The remnants of a half-eaten cherry pie and a cold cup of black coffee were pushed to the side. He was methodically cross-referencing shipping manifests, but his mind kept drifting. The conversation with Ruby had planted a strange, uncomfortable seed in his mind, a lingering doubt about the empire of fear he had built. Ruby was in the back, sitting on a stool near the kitchen doors, tallying the night's receipts under a single, warm pendant light. She enjoyed these quiet, isolated hours. The rhythmic clicking of the calculator keys and the soft scratch of her pen on paper were meditative. Brutus was asleep by the front door, acting as a living, breathing barricade against the harsh world outside. His heavy side was pressed flush against the base of the hissing radiator, absorbing the vibrations of the rushing steam. He looked peaceful, his scarred muzzle twitching occasionally as he chased phantom rabbits in his dreams. Then, the absolute silence of the diner was violently, unapologetically violated. The chime above the diner door didn't just ring, it shrieked. The heavy glass door was kicked inward with such immense, concentrated force that it bypassed the lock entirely and ripped the upper hinge straight out of the doorframe. The lower pane of safety glass exploded inward, showering the checkered linoleum in 1,000 glittering, deadly diamonds. The cold, sleet-filled wind howled immediately into the warm diner, bringing with it the sharp, metallic scent of impending violence and the sour odor of wet wool. A man stepped through the shattered, jagged frame. He was tall, gaunt, and heavily scarred, the left side of his face pulled taut into a permanent, sneering grimace from an old burn. He wore a heavy, rain-slicked leather trench coat that swept the floor, hiding the bulk of whatever weapons he carried. In his right hand, extended with terrifying steadiness, he held a heavily customized, suppressed automatic pistol. The matte black metal seemed to absorb the dim light of the diner. It was Elias Thorne, a ghost from Silas's past, a former lieutenant who had been exiled a decade ago for attempting a bloody, ruthless coup that had almost cost Silas his life. Thorne had spent the last 10 years in the shadows of the neighboring state, building a rival syndicate fueled entirely by a festering, all-consuming hatred for the man who had banished him and burned his face. He had finally come back to claim his revenge. "Hello, Silas," Thorne hissed. His voice was raspy, ruined by the same fire that had scarred his face, sounding like dry, dead leaves being crushed under heavy boots. He stepped further into the room, his heavy combat boots crunching loudly over the broken glass, tracking freezing slush onto the floor. I told you I'd come back for what's mine. 10 years in the cold, while you sat in here eating pie. Silas didn't flinch. He didn't drop his pen. He slowly closed the leather-bound ledger with a soft thud, his face instantly locking into a mask of absolute terrifying calm. His eyes swept over Thorne, calculating the threat level, noting the suppressor, the stance, the sheer desperate malice in the man's posture. "You're trespassing, Elias," Silas said, his voice dropping to that chilling, hollow whisper that made stronger men weep. "And you're tracking mud onto a freshly mopped floor." The moment Thorne's heavy boot had violently impacted the door, Brutus had erupted from his slumber. The dog didn't just wake up. The shockwave traveling through the floorboards jolted him into a state of hypervigilance. He scrambled to his feet, 100 pounds of coiled, lethal muscle. He stood squarely in the aisle between Thorne and Silas. His massive chest expanded to its absolute limit, the thick, corded muscles in his neck trembling with contained fury. He let out a deep, vibrating roar that physically shook the coffee mugs stacked on the counter, his jaws snapping aggressively, revealing the terrifying length of his canines. But from her vantage point near the kitchen doors, Ruby dropped her pen. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the scene unfold. Noticing something terribly, fundamentally wrong, Thorne was speaking. His voice was dripping with venom, loud enough to echo off the tiled walls, and he had raised the gun, pointing it directly at Silas's chest with a locked elbow. A normal, trained guard dog, even a highly aggressive one, would track the immediate, active threat. It would track the raised arm, the focal point of the aggression, the voice of the shouting intruder. But Brutus wasn't looking at Thorne's face. He wasn't looking at the gun. The massive dog was spinning in tight, frantic, agonizing circles in the center of the aisle. His ears, which should have been pricked forward to locate the source of the noise, were pinned flat, defensively against his skull. His amber eyes were wide, dilated, and unseeing, rolling wildly in their sockets. He was snapping viciously at the empty air near his own left flank, completely disoriented. Thorne laughed. A cruel, sharp, barking sound that grated against the tension in the room. He didn't look intimidated. He looked amused. "This is it?" Thorne scoffed, gesturing with the pistol. "This is the legendary monster everyone's terrified of? This spinning top? He's lost his damn mind, Silas. He doesn't even know what room he's in." Thorne took a heavy, deliberate, mocking step forward, bringing his heavy heel down hard against the floorboards. Stomp. Instantly, the spinning stopped. Brutus snapped his heavy head down, staring directly at Thorne's boots. The dog didn't lunge for the man's throat, or his gun arm. He lunged low, aiming wildly for the area of the floor where the vibration had originated, snapping his jaws at Thorne's shins. Thorne sidestepped easily, kicking out with his heavy boot. The steel toe caught the massive dog squarely in the shoulder. The impact sent Brutus skidding backward across the slippery, wet linoleum. The Pitbull scrambled wildly, his heavy claws scrabbling uselessly for purchase on the smooth floor, letting out a confused, high-pitched, pathetic yelp that completely broke the terrifying illusion of the Mafia's hellhound. From behind the counter, Ruby felt a cold chill wash over her that had nothing to do with the winter wind howling through the door. The pieces of the puzzle, fragments she had observed over the past 2 weeks, suddenly slammed together in her mind with terrifying clarity. The shattered water glass last week, he hadn't attacked the man. He had attacked the vibration of the crash on the floor. The way he only calmed down when she violently stomped her foot to get his attention. The way he was completely ignoring Thorne's shouting voice right now, but reacting with deadly speed to the heavy thud of his footsteps. The way he always slept pressed against Silas's leg or the vibrating radiator. Brutus wasn't a bloodthirsty killer. He wasn't just heavily traumatized from the fighting ring. The dog was profoundly, completely deaf. In a criminal world, defined by sharp noises, the crack of gunshots, the shouts of angry men, the crunch of breaking bone, the massive Pitbull lived in a box of absolute, terrifying silence. He couldn't hear verbal commands to attack or stand down. He couldn't hear approaching threats creeping up behind him. He relied entirely, desperately, on the vibrations he could feel through the floorboards, sudden flashes of visual movement, and the sharp, metallic scent of human fear. When the environment became chaotic, filled with multiple moving parts, conflicting vibrations from shifting feet, and visual overload, the dog didn't become aggressive. He became hopelessly, overwhelmingly, blindingly panicked. He was a gladiator thrust into a dark arena with a blindfold on, swinging wildly at ghosts. Thorn leveled the gun back at Silas, completely ignoring the scrambling dog who was now trying to reorient himself. "It ends tonight, old friend," Thorn growled, wrapping his finger around the trigger. "You, the dog, your little empire, everything burns tonight." Ruby looked at Silas. The Mafia boss sat perfectly still, his eyes locked on Thorn's gun, his hand subtly inching toward the heavy silver cane resting against the booth. But Ruby realized in a sickening rush that Silas didn't know. The brilliant, calculating architect, the man who prided himself on knowing everyone's deepest secrets, had no idea that his ultimate protector was fighting a battle in a terrifying sensory void. If Silas moved suddenly, if he shouted a command, the visual cue and the vibration would only confuse Brutus further, potentially causing the dog to attack Silas in a blind panic. If Thorn pulled the trigger, the dog wouldn't even hear the shot. He would only feel Silas hit the floor. Ruby was the only person in the room who understood the actual battlefield. She looked at the terrified dog, then at the man with the gun. She dropped the receipts, her mind racing, preparing to do something incredibly stupid, recklessly dangerous, and completely necessary. The standoff in the diner felt like it was suspended in amber. Thorn stood with the suppressed pistol aimed squarely at Silas's chest, a triumphant sneer twisting his scarred features. Silas remained seated, his posture rigid, his dark eyes calculating a dozen different angles of survival, all of them bleak. Between them, Brutus was a frantic mess of silver muscle, his paws slipping on the wet floor as he tried to orient himself to a threat he could feel but couldn't comprehend. Ruby didn't shout. Shouting was useless. She grabbed a heavy, metal serving tray from the counter. She didn't throw it at Thorn. Instead, she slammed it down onto the stainless steel prep table next to her with every ounce of strength she possessed. The physical noise was deafening. A harsh crash that made both Thorn and Silas flinch violently, but Brutus didn't even twitch his ears. The dog continued to face the opposite direction, frantically scanning the empty aisle, completely oblivious to the massive sonic impact that had just occurred 10 feet behind him. The confirmation solidified in Ruby's chest. She had to take control of the environment. She stepped out from the kitchen area, moving into Thorn's peripheral vision. "Hey," she yelled, ensuring Thorn looked at her. Thorn's eyes flicked to the waitress, his gun wavering for a fraction of a second. "Shut up and stay back, sweetheart. This doesn't concern you. You're making a mistake," Ruby said, her voice remarkably steady. She wasn't looking at Thorn. She was looking intently at Brutus. She began walking slowly, heavily, toward the center of the room. She exaggerated each step, bringing the heel of her thick-soled shoes down hard against the wooden floorboards. Thump, thump, thump. The vibrations cut through the chaos in the dog's sensory world. Brutus stopped spinning. His head snapped around, tracking the rhythmic pulses through the floor. He saw Ruby. "What the hell are you doing?" Silas hissed, his carefully constructed facade cracking. "Ruby, get out of the way!" Ruby ignored him. She stopped walking and locked eyes with the frantic Pitbull. She raised both of her hands high in the air, palms facing outward, her fingers splayed wide. It was a universal gesture of surrender. But to the dog, it was a massive, clear visual anchor in a confusing room. She held the pose, her breathing slow and deliberate, pushing every ounce of calm, grounding energy she could muster into her posture. Brutus stared at her raised hands. His chest heaved violently, but the frantic clicking of his teeth stopped. Slowly, deliberately, Ruby brought her hands down in a smooth, sweeping motion, ending with her palms facing the floor, pressing downward. It wasn't a standard obedience command. It was a physical manifestation of grounding. Settle. Lower. Calm. The effect was instantaneous. The dog, desperate for direction in his silent world, mirrored the heavy downward motion of her hands. His hind legs gave way, and he dropped into a sit, his heavy tail thumping once, uncertainly, against the floor. Thorn looked from the dog to the waitress, utterly baffled. "What kind of circus trick is this?" he scoffed, his grip tightening on the pistol. "You think teaching the mutt to sit is going to save you?" Ruby turned her head just enough to look at Silas. "Silas," she said, her voice ringing clearly in the quiet diner. "He can't hear you. He's never been able to hear you. He's completely deaf." Silas's eyes widened, a profound shock rippling across his face. He looked at the dog, then at Ruby, the pieces of a decade-long puzzle suddenly rearranging themselves in his mind. The unresponsiveness to verbal commands, the extreme reaction to sudden movements. The way the dog always insisted on sleeping physically touching Silas's leg, needing the vibration of his master's pulse to know he was safe. He hadn't been breeding a monster. He had been sheltering a broken, terrified survivor. The revelation shifted the power dynamic in the room entirely. Silas wasn't a man reliant on a wild beast anymore. He was a man who suddenly understood the profound loyalty of a crippled friend. He slowly pushed himself up from the booth, leaning heavily on his silver cane. His fear was gone, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. Thorne sensed the shift. He panicked, stepping back and raising the gun toward Ruby. "I said stay back," he yelled. He stomped his foot nervously. The sudden vibration spiked through the floor. Brutus, now grounded and focused solely on visual cues and vibrations, felt the sharp, aggressive stomp. He didn't spin in confusion this time. He looked exactly to where the vibration originated, saw the man pointing a weapon at the woman who had brought him peace, and without a single sound, the silver bullet launched himself across the room. The aftermath of Brutus's launch was swift and brutally silent. The massive Pitbull hit Thorne squarely in the chest, the sheer kinetic force of 100 pounds of airborne muscle driving the breath from the assassin's lungs. Thorne slammed backward into the shattered glass of the entryway, his suppressed pistol clattering harmlessly across the linoleum. Brutus didn't tear out the man's throat. He simply stood over Thorne, his heavy paws pinning the man's shoulders, his jaws inches from Thorne's face, emitting a silent, vibrating growl that Thorne could feel rattling his teeth. Silas crossed the room with surprising speed for a man who relied on a cane. He kicked the discarded pistol into the corner, then stood over his fallen enemy. "You always were loud, Elias," Silas said coldly, "and careless. Get out of my city. If I ever see your face again, I won't call the dog off. In fact, I'll let him finish what you started." Thorne, terrified and gasping for air beneath the crushing weight of the dog, managed a frantic nod. Silas looked at Ruby. Ruby made a short, sharp upward motion with her hand. Brutus immediately stepped back, releasing Thorne, who scrambled to his feet and fled into the freezing night, leaving a trail of blood and shattered pride in his wake. The diner fell dead silent again, the cold wind howling through the broken door. Silas stood motionless for a long time, staring out into the darkness. Then, very slowly, he lowered himself into the nearest booth, his cane clattering to the floor. He buried his face in his hands, a gesture of profound exhaustion and vulnerability that no one in his organization had ever witnessed. Ruby walked over, picking up his cane and leaning it against the table. She sat opposite him. Brutus immediately trotted over, bypassing Silas entirely, and pressed his heavy, scarred head into Ruby's lap, letting out a long, fluttering sigh. Ruby began massaging the thick muscles behind his ears. 10 years, Silas whispered, his voice muffled by his hands. He slowly lowered them, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. 10 years I've had him. I thought he was just broken, aggressive, uncontrollable. I built my entire reputation around the fact that I walked with a demon on a leash. And the whole time he was just terrified. He was trapped in a silent box, trying to protect me from things he couldn't even understand. "You didn't know," Ruby said softly. "I should have known." Silas's voice cracked, a sudden surge of raw emotion breaking through his iron facade. "I pride myself on seeing everything, on knowing everyone's weaknesses, and I couldn't see the terror in the eyes of the only creature that ever actually cared if I lived or died." He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and laid it gently over Ruby's hand as she pet the dog. "I used him. I used his panic as a weapon." Ruby didn't pull her hand away. "You saved him from a fighting ring, Silas. You gave him a safe place to sleep. You didn't understand his language, but you gave him a life. And tonight, when he realized you were in danger, and he finally had clear direction..." He didn't hesitate. Silas looked down at the dog. For the first time, he didn't see a weapon. He saw a survivor. He saw the ragged scars, the graying muzzle, the absolute devotion in the amber eyes that were now peacefully closed. The armor that Silas had worn for decades, the coldness, the ruthlessness, the calculated distance fractured completely. He let out a ragged breath, the sound of a man who had been carrying an unbearable weight and suddenly realized he could put it down. "How did you know?" Silas asked. his voice barely above a whisper. How did you see what I couldn't? Because I've spent my life watching people who are trapped, Ruby replied, her dark eyes reflecting the dim light. When you lose a sense, or when you lose your voice, you have to read the world differently. You read the heavy footsteps. You read the tension in a room. You read the vibrations of anger. Brutus is deaf, Silas. But he listens to the truth of a room better than anyone I've ever met. Silas slowly moved his hand from Ruby's and placed it flat on the table. He looked at the shattered door, the cold wind blowing the napkins off the counter. He looked at the empire of fear he had built. And suddenly, it all tasted like ashes in his mouth. I don't want to do this anymore, Ruby, the mafia boss confessed, the words hanging in the cold air like a prayer. I don't want to be the monster in the dark. Then don't be, Ruby said simply. She reached out and tapped the table twice with her knuckles. The vibration traveled through the wood. Brutus opened his eyes, lifted his head, and looked at Silas, waiting for a signal, ready for whatever came next. The decision Silas made that night was not one the underworld accepted quietly. A king cannot simply step down from a throne built on blood and terror. He must either defend it or be buried beneath it. Within 48 hours, the rumors of Silas's sudden display of weakness sparing Thorn, the broken door, the lack of retaliation spread like a virus through the syndicate. Weakness was an invitation, and in a city run by wolves, an invitation meant war. It was a Thursday evening, just as the sun dipped below the city skyline, painting the heavy clouds in bruises of purple and black. The Midnight Owl was empty, save for Silas, Ruby, and Brutus. Silas had spent the last 2 days liquidating assets, making quiet phone calls, and preparing to disappear. He was dressed not in his usual tailored suit, but in a heavy wool sweater and dark jeans, looking less like a crime lord and more like a weary traveler. Ruby was wiping down the pie case when the low rumble of multiple heavy engines vibrated through the diner's front window. She didn't need to look up to know trouble had arrived. Brutus felt it first. The dog, who had been resting peacefully by the radiator, suddenly stood up. He didn't growl. Instead, he padded over to Ruby, pressing his heavy flank tightly against her leg, his eyes fixed on the front door, his ears alert but flat. 4 black SUVs idled outside, their headlights cutting harsh white swathes through the gloom. The doors opened in unison. A dozen men stepped out. They weren't Thorne's amateur street thugs. These were professionals, heavily armed, wearing tactical vests beneath dark jackets. At their head was Marcus. Silas's own second-in-command, Don Bishon, had finally eclipsed his loyalty. "They're here," Silas said quietly, standing up from his booth. He didn't reach for his cane. He reached beneath the table and pulled out a heavy pump-action shotgun, checking the chamber with a sickening, metallic clack-clack. Marcus pushed open the newly repaired glass door. The bell chimed merrily, a grotesque contrast to the heavily armed death squad filtering into the diner, fanning out with practiced precision. They locked the door behind them and pulled the heavy blinds down, plunging the diner into a claustrophobic, artificial twilight. "Silas," Marcus said smoothly, his hands resting casually on the grips of his tactical belt. "You're slipping, old man. Sparing Thorne? Liquidating the harbor accounts? The commission is worried you've lost your nerve. They sent me to transition the leadership." Silas racked the shotgun, the sound echoing loudly. "Transition implies, I'm leaving voluntarily, Marcus. You brought a lot of firepower for a retirement party." The air in the diner instantly thickened to a suffocating pressure. The 12 men raised their weapons, a deadly array of automatic rifles and heavy pistols leveled directly at Silas. In the center of the storm, Brutus was overwhelmed. The heavy boots of 12 men stepping simultaneously had sent a shockwave of chaotic vibrations through the floorboards. The visual of so many raised weapons and tense, aggressive postures flooded the dog's visual processing. He was cut off from auditory cues, surrounded by the physical manifestation of lethal intent. The panic that Ruby had worked so hard to soothe came rushing back. Brutus let out a terrible, high-pitched whine, spinning away from Ruby and placing himself squarely in front of Silas. But he didn't know who to attack. He snapped blindly at the air, his heavy tail tucked tightly between his legs, his body trembling violently. He was a creature designed for combat, completely paralyzed by sensory overload, terrified not for himself, but for the man he was desperately trying to protect. Marcus laughed, a dry, cruel sound. "Look at the great hellhound. He's broken, Silas. Just like you. Put the gun down. You know you can't take all of us. Don't make the girl clean up your brains. Silas's jaw tightened. He knew Marcus was right. He could take down 3, maybe 4, before they shredded him. And in the crossfire, Ruby and Brutus would be slaughtered. The mafia boss, who had never surrendered in his life, felt the heavy, bitter weight of defeat settling over his shoulders. He began to slowly lower the barrel of the shotgun. Wait, Ruby's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the heavy, adrenaline-soaked air like a cracking whip. She stepped out from behind the counter, not with her hands raised in surrender, but with her fists clenched at her sides. She walked directly into the center of the kill zone, placing herself between the dozen loaded assault rifles and the terrified, spinning Pitbull. "Are you insane, sweetheart?" Marcus sneered, adjusting his grip on his rifle. "Move out of the way or you die first." Ruby completely ignored the guns, pointed at her chest. She focused entirely on the frantic silver dog. She knew that any sudden movement, any display of fear, would escalate the situation into a bloodbath. She had to break the tension, and she had to do it using a language only one creature in the room understood. She stomped her foot. Hard. The vibration cut through the chaotic noise of shuffling boots. Brutus stopped spinning, his chest heaving, his amber eyes locking onto Ruby. What Ruby did next defied every instinct of survival, every rule of conflict, and completely shattered the reality of the hardened killers standing in the room. She didn't yell. She didn't threaten. She dropped straight down onto both knees, the impact echoing loudly against the floorboards. She made herself small, vulnerable, and completely open in the center of a dozen pointed guns. She took a massive theatrical breath, inhaling deeply, and then released it slowly, dropping her shoulders heavily. She raised both hands and placed her palms flat against the wooden floor, spreading her fingers wide. She pressed down, creating a steady, grounded pressure. Then, she looked up at the massive, terrified Pitbull and gave a single, slow, deliberate blink. It was the ultimate display of trust and de-escalation. In the language of the silent, terrified animal, it was a beacon of absolute safety shining through a storm of panic. Brutus stared at her. The frantic energy that had been vibrating through his muscles evaporated. The heavy, terrifying monster that the underworld feared let out a soft, incredibly vulnerable whimper. He took one step forward, then another. He ignored the men with the guns. He ignored Silas. He walked directly up to the kneeling waitress and, with a heavy groan, collapsed onto the floor, resting his massive, scarred head directly onto Ruby's lap, completely submitting to her calm energy. The silence in the diner was absolute and deafening. 12 hardened killers, men who had seen unspeakable violence and committed atrocities without blinking, stood paralyzed. The psychological dissonance of what they were witnessing broke their concentration entirely. They had come expecting a chaotic firefight, expecting to battle a legendary hellhound. Instead, they were watching the city's most feared beast acting like a frightened puppy seeking comfort from a waitress in a stained uniform. The terrifying illusion of Silas's monster was shattered, but not in a way that made him look weak. It made the entire situation surreal, uncanny, and profoundly uncomfortable. The adrenaline that had been fueling Marcus's men suddenly had nowhere to go. Their weapons drooped slightly, confusion replacing their lethal intent. Silas didn't miss the opening. He didn't raise his shotgun. Instead, he stepped out from behind the booth, walking smoothly toward Marcus. His demeanor completely changed. He wasn't the ruthless architect anymore. He was a man who had nothing left to hide, and therefore, nothing left to lose. "Look at him, Marcus," Silas said, his voice calm, echoing in the quiet room. "You came here to kill a monster. But there are no monsters here. Just terrified animals lashing out in the dark." Silas stopped 3 feet from Marcus. "I'm done running the shadows. I'm done feeding the fear. You want the territory? Take it. You want the ledgers? They're on the counter. But if you pull that trigger today, you're not killing a boss. You're just murdering a waitress, a deaf dog, and an old man in a diner. And the commission will know that Marcus the Great inherited the throne by executing civilians." Marcus stared at Silas, his jaw working. He looked at the ledgers. He looked at the kneeling woman softly stroking the head of the sleeping beast. The glory of the kill had been entirely stripped away, replaced by a pathetic, dishonorable reality. To shoot now wouldn't be an assassination. It would be a butchery. Marcus slowly lowered his rifle. He looked at his men, giving a tight, frustrated jerk of his head. "Take the books," he snapped to one of his lieutenants. "We're leaving." They backed out of the diner slowly, keeping their eyes on Silas, but stealing bewildered glances at Ruby and the dog. The bells chimed cheerfully as the glass door opened and closed. The engines of the SUVs roared to life, tires squealing against the wet pavement as the convoy peeled away into the night, leaving behind an empire, a shattered myth, and 3 survivors in a neon-lit diner. The heavy silence that followed the departure of the SUVs was different from any silence the Midnight Owl had ever held. It wasn't suffocating or laden with unspoken threats. It was the vast, clean quiet that follows a devastating storm. The air felt lighter, the neon buzzing outside less like a warning and more like a simple mechanical hum. Silas stood in the center of the room, the pump-action shotgun dangling loosely from his right hand. He looked around the diner, at the worn vinyl booths, the flickering lights, the coffee stains on the linoleum. For a decade, this had been his fortress, his war room, his purgatory. Now, it was just a cheap restaurant. The invisible chains that had bound him to this life, the reputation, the fear, the necessity of absolute control had snapped. He walked over to the counter, broke the shotgun open, and emptied the heavy red shells onto the stainless steel prep surface. The metal clatter was definitive. He left the gun on the counter, a discarded relic of a man who no longer existed. Ruby was still sitting on the floor, her legs crossed. Brutus was deeply asleep in her lap, his massive ribcage rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic cadence. He was snoring softly, a gentle, rumbling sound that vibrated through Ruby's legs. She continued to rhythmically stroke the thick, scarred skin behind his ears, her face illuminated by the soft yellow light overhead. She looked exhausted, her uniform rumpled and smeared with dust, but her dark eyes were peaceful. Silas approached her slowly. He didn't loom over her as he once would have. He lowered himself down, sitting awkwardly on the hard floor opposite her, his expensive wool sweater bunching up around his shoulders. He looked at the sleeping dog, then up at the waitress who had dismantled his entire world with a stomp of her foot and a sweeping gesture of her hands. "He's really asleep," Silas whispered, a note of profound wonder in his voice. "With all those men, with the guns, he just let it go." "He didn't let it go, Silas," Ruby corrected gently, keeping her voice low so as not to send any sharp vibrations through the floor. "He gave it to me. He couldn't carry the fear anymore, so he let me carry it for him. That's what you do when you trust someone." Silas absorbed the words, feeling them settle deep in his chest. Trust. It was a concept entirely foreign to his previous life. He had demanded obedience. He had bought loyalty. He had engineered fear. But trust was something that had to be freely given, often in the most vulnerable moments. "I left the ledgers on the counter," Silas said, leaning his back against the base of the nearest booth. "Marcus will take the territory. By tomorrow morning, I won't have an empire. I won't have the money. I won't be the architect anymore." He looked at his hands, expecting to feel panic, but finding only a strange, buoyant emptiness. "I don't even know who I am without it." Ruby smiled, a small, genuine curve of her lips that reached her eyes. "You're a man who needs to learn how to walk his dog in the daylight." Silas let out a breath that was half laugh, half sob. He reached across the space between them. He didn't reach for the dog this time. He reached for Ruby. He gently took her calloused, dust-covered hand in his. He didn't squeeze it with authority. He simply held it, anchoring himself to the reality of the woman who had saved him. "Where do we go?" Silas asked, the "we" slipping out naturally, an undeniable acknowledgement of the bond that had been forged in the crucible of the night. "Somewhere quiet," Ruby said, gently shifting her legs, causing Brutus to stir and lift his heavy head. The dog looked at Silas, blinked sleepily, and let out a soft whine. "Somewhere where he doesn't have to be a monster, and you don't have to be a king." Silas nodded slowly. He pushed himself off the floor, offering his hand to help Ruby up. Brutus stood up, shaking his massive silver body, the tags on his collar jingling softly, a sound he would never hear, but a vibration he felt against his chest. They didn't pack anything. They left the diner exactly as it was. Silas unlocked the front door, pulling it open to the crisp, freezing pre-dawn air. The rain had stopped, and the sky in the east was bruising a deep, hopeful indigo. Silas walked out first, breathing in the cold air. Ruby followed, pulling her cardigan tight around her shoulders. Brutus walked between them. He didn't scan the perimeter for threats. He didn't walk with the stiff, aggressive gait of a guard dog. He walked with his head up, looking between the tall man and the quiet woman, his heavy tail wagging in a slow, steady rhythm, guided by the visual cues of their relaxed shoulders and the peaceful vibrations of their footsteps. They stepped out of the neon shadows and walked away into the breaking dawn, 3 scarred survivors, finally learning how to navigate the world in the quiet light. True power is rarely found in the ability to incite fear or wield control over others. It is found in the courage to strip away our armor and understand the hidden wounds of those around us. Silas believed his strength came from a monster, only to discover that his salvation came from a woman who recognized the monster was simply a terrified soul desperate for a guiding light. We all carry invisible scars and silent battles. And sometimes, the most revolutionary act we can perform is to offer peace instead of punishment. If this story moved you and reminded you of the power of empathy, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps bring more profound, dramatic stories to life. Thank you for reading.